Sir, this area is restricted. You're not authorized to stand here. The words cut cold through the hotel lobby as it prepared for the Marine Corps birthday ball, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. A young U.S. Marine captain stood squarely in front of an elderly man with silver hair. The old man's name was Thomas Hale, 87 years old, wearing a worn, time-softened jacket. No uniform, no medals, only his granddaughter, standing close beside him, as if afraid he might be swept away from this place. "Where's your invitation?" The captain continued, his voice even but sharp. "This is a Marine Corps ball. Not everyone is allowed inside." The granddaughter spoke quickly, her breath tight. "My grandfather was invited. His name is on the list of honored guests." But the officer did not answer her. He merely glanced over the old man's simple clothing and let out a faint smile, a smile that made no effort to hide its doubt. An honored guest. Looking like that, the people nearby began to slow. Eyes lingered, the murmurs softened, and Thomas Hale remained silent. He did not argue. He did not explain. He did not react. He simply stood there so calm that the arrogance facing him began to turn into irritation. And it was that silence that pushed the conflict into a new threshold. If you believe that true courage does not live in gunfire, but in the silence of those who have walked through war, subscribe to Service Honor Stories so we can preserve the memory, dignity, and reverence owed to our quiet heroes. Thomas Hale said nothing. He did not argue, did not explain, did not try to prove who he was. He simply stood still in the vast hotel lobby as if every sound around him had passed by long ago. His thin but steady hand rested lightly against the chest of his old jacket, where a patch had worn so badly its original shape was almost unrecognizable. The gesture was not defensive. It was habitual. Like the way a person places a hand on a familiar memory when they need to steady themselves. Thomas's gaze did not settle on the young captain standing before him. It drifted farther away, deeper, as if listening to something that did not exist in this room. Perhaps an old voice. Perhaps a command once spoken through wind and gun smoke. Or perhaps nothing at all, just the silence he had carried for decades ever since he left. Places other people never want to remember. "Are you listening to me?" Captain Cole spoke up, his voice slightly sharper than before. "I'm asking you a question." Thomas Hale still did not respond. He did not turn his head. He did not frown. There was no sign of confusion. His calm did not resemble the slowness of old age. It resembled the composure of someone accustomed to waiting. Waiting in situations where a single wrong reaction could mean the end of everything. Emily felt the tension tightening in the air. She squeezed his hand gently, as if trying to pull him away from the captain's increasingly hard gaze. But Thomas did not move. He stood there solid in a way that unsettled the man facing him. Not because he resisted, but because he refused to participate in the power game unfolding before him. Captain Cole studied the old man and felt a dull irritation rise in his chest. To him, this was simply an elderly man who didn't understand the situation. Someone confused between past and present. Someone unaware that he was standing in the wrong place. "Your age does not give you the right to ignore orders," Cole said, his voice dropping. "I need your cooperation." Thomas blinked once, slowly. Then his eyes drifted away again. Not in challenge, not in contempt, simply because there was no need to answer. He had heard louder voices than this. He had stood before younger men than this, men who believed the rank on their shoulders was enough to decide everything. And over the years, he had learned that not every word required a response. The prolonged silence led Cole to a fatal misunderstanding. He took it as weakness, as a sign of someone no longer clear-minded enough to protect himself. He stepped a little closer, his tone carrying a veneer of forced patience. "If you're not answering," Cole concluded, "then you have nothing to say. And if that's the case, I'll decide for you." Thomas Hale remained still. The old patch beneath his hand was like an anchor holding him in the present. His eyes flickered for a brief instant, as if a memory had brushed against him. Not a memory of victory, but of those who were no longer standing there to be silent, as he was now. Those who never had the chance to step out of the past. Emily looked up at him, worry and helplessness mingling in her eyes. She wanted to speak for him, wanted to tell everyone who he had once been. But Thomas would not allow it. He squeezed her hand gently, just enough for her to understand that some things exist without ever needing to be spoken. Captain Cole exhaled sharply. The calm before him no longer felt harmless. It began to feel like an affront. A man who did not answer orders. A man who did not appear afraid. And in the world Cole knew that meant something had to be broken. It was in that very moment when Cole believed silence was nothing more than a sign of weakness that he chose to push things further, turning the stillness of Thomas Hale into the target of a public humiliation. Captain Cole let out a small laugh, quiet but sharp enough to cut into the tightening air. No uniform, no papers. Just a few old stories, he said, his voice slow, as if explaining things to the entire lobby. Is that all? The words dropped among the surrounding crowd like a small stone tossed into still water. A few soft chuckles followed. Not loud, not openly cruel, but enough for Thomas Hale to hear. Enough for Emily to hear. Enough to tear the earlier silence into something jagged and uncomfortable. Cole noticed the reaction and pressed on. He took half a step forward, his eyes flicking over the old jacket on the elderly man's shoulders. No official insignia, no military ID. Nothing to prove you ever served, Cole continued. Anyone can tell a good story. Anyone can call themselves a hero. Thomas Hale still did not speak. He stood as before, unmoving, but Emily felt a subtle change in him. The hand resting on his jacket tightened slightly. Not out of fear, but because something deeper had just been touched. Cole reached out, without hesitation. His fingertip brushed against the worn, frayed patch on the old man's jacket. This, Cole said, his tone dripping with mockery, looks like a souvenir from some roadside shop. Cheap. Old. It doesn't mean anything. Emily blurted out, her voice shaking with anger. You have no right, Thomas gave a slight shake of his head. Just the smallest motion. But it was enough to stop her. He didn't look at her. He simply placed his hand over hers, gentle yet firm, like a familiar command from long ago. Emily bit her lip. She understood. Even as her heart pounded, even as every part of her wanted to fight back, he would not allow it. The instant Cole's finger touched the patch, Thomas Hale faltered just briefly, but long enough for an old memory to surface. Not as clear images, but as sensation. A familiar weight in his chest. The smell of smoke and metal he had carried all his life. That patch had once been new, once sharp, once stitched onto a jacket inside a cramped tent, where men far younger than he was now tried to hide their fear behind short words and hardened eyes. Cole saw none of it. To him, the reaction was nothing more than the awkwardness of old age. He smirked. See, Cole said, turning half toward the crowd. He doesn't even know what he's wearing. Some people nearby lowered their eyes. Others turned away. Not everyone was comfortable with what they were witnessing. But no one spoke. Their silence was not like Thomas Hale's. It carried hesitation, avoidance, the safe choice of those who didn't want trouble. Thomas drew in a slow breath, then let it out. He didn't look at Cole. He didn't look at the crowd. His gaze dropped to the old patch beneath his hand. In that moment, he was no longer standing in a hotel lobby. He was standing among those who never came back. Those who once wore the same symbol. Those who believed their existence would never be spoken of. Emily looked at him and saw what the others could not. A pain-light, deep flicker across his eyes, then fade. She understood that he was not being humiliated by Cole's words. He was being wounded by the dismissal of memory, by names erased from history, now turned into a joke before a crowd. Cole pulled his hand back as if the matter were settled. I think that's enough, he said. We can't allow someone like you to disrupt the event. Thomas Hale still did not answer. But this time his silence was no longer just calm. It carried a different weight, something waiting to be recognized. And as the last soft laugh faded at the edge of the lobby, stood a man watching the worn patch on Thomas Hale's jacket, realizing that the thing just dismissed as cheap was far from ordinary after all. Michael Grant had been standing at the edge of the lobby since the beginning of the incident. He didn't step in. He didn't speak. He simply watched. As the hotel's head of security, that was professional habit. But as a former Marine Corps gunnery sergeant, it was something deeper, an instinct honed over years in uniform. Judge the man, not the appearance. Grant noticed Captain Cole the moment it began. A young officer, straight-backed, rigid voice, more accustomed to giving orders than listening. Grant knew the type. He had trained men like him, corrected them, and he had also watched some of them fall apart because they never learned the difference between authority and dignity. But Grant's attention didn't stay on Cole. It settled on the old man standing opposite him. Thomas Hale. Grant didn't know his name at first, but he recognized something else. A stillness that didn't belong to the weak. A posture that didn't belong to someone out of place. It was the stance of a man who had grown used to being watched in silence, who had survived when no one stood behind him. Grant saw Thomas's hand resting on the old patch. Not clenched, not trembling, just resting there, like a quiet reminder to himself. Thomas's eyes were neither evasive nor defiant. They were calm, so calm it sent a chill through Grant. He had seen that look before. In men who returned from missions that had no names. In men who never told stories yet carried entire cemeteries in their memory. When Cole delivered his final mocking remark, Grant stepped forward one pace. Not fast, not rushed. "Captain," he said, his voice low and measured, "we can handle this more respectfully." Cole turned. His eyes hardened. "Sergeant," he replied deliberately, emphasizing Grant's former rank as a reminder. "This is an internal Marine Corps matter. Return to your post." Grant didn't argue. He understood the moment. A young officer under the gaze of a crowd would never back down. Grant gave a small nod, barely noticeable. But his eyes never left Thomas Hale. He knew that if this continued, it would go far beyond a routine check. Grant stepped back. No one noticed. The crowd remained focused on Cole and the old man. Grant pulled out his phone. It wasn't a duty number, not an official channel. It was a personal line used only when things passed beyond ordinary authority. Colonel Harris Grant said when the call connected, his voice low and concise. "I'm at the Grand Majestic. We have a situation." The response came quickly. "Go on." Grant looked once more at Thomas Hale. Then he said, "An elderly veteran is being detained. His name is Thomas Hale." There was a strange pause. Not static. Not a busy line. The silence of someone who had just heard a name that should not have appeared here. Grant didn't add anything. He let the silence speak for itself. "Say that again." Colonel Harris finally said, his tone changed. Thomas Hale, Grant repeated. "He's in the lobby. And this isn't right." The line stayed quiet. Grant heard a deep breath, then a short sentence sharp as an order. "Maintain the situation. Do not let anyone touch him." Grant ended the call. He put the phone away, his hand slightly unsteady but his eyes firm. He looked back at Cole. The young officer was still talking, still believing he controlled the situation. Grant knew that from this moment on, everything had moved beyond Cole's reach. Thomas Hale remained standing where he was. No one told him what had just happened. Yet Grant had the distinct sense that the old man knew, not because he had heard anything, but because he was familiar with the feeling. The feeling when an invisible chain of events begins to move. Grant straightened his posture. He did not intervene again. Not out of fear, but because he understood this truth: when the right names are spoken, real authority finds its own way. And from that brief phone call, information left the quiet hotel lobby and climbed to higher levels where silence was no longer a choice, but an order, preparing the way for a truth about to be revealed. Colonel David Harris stood still for a few seconds after the call ended. The name Thomas Hale continued to echo in his mind like a sound that did not belong to the present. Harris was not the kind of officer who rattled easily. He had taken enough emergency calls, reviewed enough flawed reports. But this was different. The way Michael Grant had paused before saying that name, it wasn't accidental. Harris turned back to his desk. He accessed a system he almost never had to use. Not standard personnel files. Not commendation records. It was a multi-layered, restricted database where only names that were never meant to exist on paper appeared. He typed slowly, "Thomas Hale." The screen came up nearly blank. Most of it was blacked out. No photograph, no biography, no clear date of birth. Just a few stark lines. A project, a designation, an unofficial unit, a casualty rate that bordered on total loss. Harris tightened his jaw. He had heard of units like this when he was younger. Teams formed not to win wars, but to buy time with human lives. Harris read each line carefully. Not because it was hard to understand, but because every line carried weight. Unreported missions. Regions that did not exist on any map. Names that appeared once and then vanished forever. And at the very end, a brief note: "Sole surviving commander." Harris stood up. He didn't need to read any further. He understood why Grant had called, and he understood why Grant's voice had dropped when he spoke that name. Harris picked up the phone. This time, he did not follow protocol. He dialed Major General William Carter directly. Sir Harris said without preamble, "We have a situation at the Grand Majestic." Carter answered immediately, his voice still carrying the rhythm of someone preparing for an event. Harris. I'm in the middle of... It's Thomas Hale, Harris cut in. Not loud, but unmistakably clear. There was a long pause on the other end, not because Carter hadn't heard, but because he was processing what he had just been told. When Carter spoke again, his voice had dropped noticeably. Are you certain I've verified it? Harris replied. If this file is real, and I believe it is, then no one should lay a hand on him. Carter didn't ask another question. Hold the situation. Don't let this go any further, he ordered. I'll handle it. Harris set the phone down. He stood still for a moment as if making sure he hadn't crossed some invisible line. Then he looked back at the screen. The file was still open, still silent. But to Harris, it had already said enough. Meanwhile, in the hotel lobby, Captain Cole had no idea what was unfolding beyond his sight. He stood straighter. His voice grew firmer. He felt the attention of the crowd and mistook it for support. I've made myself clear, Cole said. We can't allow anyone to disrupt order here. Thomas Hale stood opposite him, still silent. His expression did not change. That convinced Cole he was in control. Cole turned toward Emily. You should take him and leave, he said, before this becomes more uncomfortable. Emily looked at Thomas. He didn't respond. Not because he hadn't heard, but because he was waiting. Not for Cole. For something else. A familiar sensation was beginning to rise, faint but unmistakable. The feeling that comes just before everything shifts. Just before others step in and call the truth by its proper name. Cole took another step forward, his voice dropping confident in what he believed was victory. I don't want to make this a bigger issue, he said, but I will if I have to. At the edge of the lobby, Michael Grant watched the scene with a new calm. He didn't intervene. There was no need anymore. He had done his part. From the moment that name had been spoken on the other end of the line, this story no longer belonged to the hotel lobby. Thomas Hale placed his hand on the old patch once more, lighter than before, like a quiet reminder, not for the man facing him, but for himself. That truth, no matter how long it is buried, always finds a way back. And while Cole still believed he stood at the highest point in that room, somewhere else unseen, invisible gears had begun to turn slowly but irreversibly, driving the truth straight toward the hotel lobby. Captain Cole let out a short, dry laugh. He looked Thomas Hale up and down, then spoke slowly, as if bringing a game to a close one he was certain he had already won. Every real warrior has a call sign, Cole said. So what was yours? The question landed in the lobby like a final challenge. A few people turned to look at Thomas. Emily held her breath. Michael Grant stood still, his eyes never leaving the old man. No one knew what the answer would be. No one was certain Thomas Hale would answer at all. Thomas lifted his head. Just a small movement, but enough to change the air. His gaze no longer drifted into empty distance. It focused, deep, steady. His voice came out low and firm without the slightest tremor. Iron Viper. There was no flourish, no explanation, just two words. Yet those two words extinguished the murmur that had begun to rise in the lobby. Cole frowned. He had never heard the name. In his mind, it was just another fabricated answer. He was about to laugh again when a movement behind him made him stop. A man entered the lobby. The uniform he wore carried a different kind of weight. No introduction was needed, no title announced. It was enough to see the way he moved, the way people around him instinctively straightened when they recognized who he was. Major General William Carter. Carter did not look at Cole. He did not look at the crowd. His eyes locked onto Thomas Hale. He walked straight toward the old man, stopped at a measured distance, and came to attention. Carter's voice rang out, clear and resolute. Sir, he said, it is an honor to see you again. The entire lobby fell silent. Carter raised his hand in salute, the highest form of military respect. Not a polite gesture. Not a ceremonial courtesy. It was the salute of one soldier to another, whom he held in absolute reverence. He held it longer than required. Thomas Hale looked at him, then gave a slight nod. Just a small one. Enough for Carter to lower his hand. Cole stood frozen. Every familiar structure in his mind seemed to collapse at once. Sir, he stammered. What is... Carter turned his head. His gaze passed over Cole for a brief instant. Silence, he said. Not loudly, but firmly enough to leave Cole rigid where he stood. Carter faced the crowd again. For those of you who do not know, he said, his voice deep and deliberate. The man standing before you is not an ordinary guest. He paused, allowing each word its place. Thomas Hale is the founder and commanding officer of Iron Viper. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd, quickly subdued by the gravity in Carter's tone. It was an unofficial unit, he continued. No name on any map. No public records. Their missions were never written into reports. Carter looked at Thomas Hale once more. He's the only one who survived, Carter said. The others did not return. He turned back to the crowd. The decorations he received were never awarded in public ceremonies. There were no stages, no cameras, because what they did was never meant to exist. Emily raised a hand to her mouth. Tears spilled over. Michael Grant stood taller than ever. Cole felt his throat go dry. Iron Viper Carter repeated. That was not a nickname. It was a name feared by the enemy. A name that saved an entire unit from being erased. Carter turned to Cole. You asked for his call sign, he said. This is your answer. He paused. And you failed to recognize the truth when it was standing right in front of you. No one spoke after that. Thomas Hale remained where he was. Unchanged. Not proud. Not triumphant. Just an old man accustomed to truth arriving late. And in that moment when power shifted without shouting or force, a lesson began to take shape. Not through command, but through the silence of a man who had already carried more than enough. General Carter turned fully toward Captain Cole. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. His tone was low and even, each word landing like an order weighed and measured long ago. You are standing here, Carter said, wearing a uniform that thousands have worn before you. And you used it to humiliate a man who spent his entire life protecting the honor of that uniform. Cole did not respond. He stood rigid, arms straight at his sides, his face drained of color, not from fear of punishment, but from the realization of what he had just done. Carter stepped half a pace closer. Not invading, just close enough that Cole could not escape his gaze. You mistook humility for weakness, Carter continued. You mistook silence for an inability to stand up for oneself. That was your first mistake. He paused. Your second mistake was forgetting that some men do not need to prove who they are. Cole swallowed hard. Sir, he said, his voice rough, No, Carter cut him off. You don't need to say anything more. At this moment, your words cannot fix what's been done. Carter turned to the crowd. An officer is not measured by how well he gives orders, he said. He is measured by whether he recognizes who deserves respect. Cole remained still. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. For the first time since the incident began, he made no attempt to preserve his pride. In that moment, arrogance left him replaced by a heavy emptiness. He looked at Thomas Hale, his eyes no longer sharp, only shame remained. Thomas Hale took a gentle step forward. No one asked him to. No one signaled him. He placed his thin but steady hand on the tense arm of General Carter. The gesture alone was enough to make Carter stop. Thomas looked up at the general, his expression as calm as it had been from the beginning. We were all young once, Thomas said, his voice low and slow. And the uniform is heavy. Carter looked at him. The hardness in his face softened. Thomas turned to Cole. No reproach, no lecture. He did not speak of his past. He did not speak of the men who were lost. He simply looked at Cole the way one looks at someone who once stood where they themselves had stood long ago. Wear it the right way, Thomas added. It takes time, but it's worth learning. Cole lowered his head, not because of rank, but because for the first time he felt the true weight of what he carried on his shoulders. There was no applause, no murmuring, only a silence deep enough for everyone in the lobby to understand that the lesson just given was not meant for one man alone. Carter gave Thomas a slight nod. Thank you, he said, not as courtesy, but as genuine gratitude. He turned to Cole one last time. We will speak later, Carter said, and it will not be an easy conversation. Yes, sir, Cole replied quietly. His voice held no confidence now, but neither did it flee from responsibility. He stood there, accepting the consequences, in the very silence he had once dismissed. Thomas Hale stepped back, returning to his place. He did not need to stand at the center. He never had. Emily moved closer and took his hand. Thomas squeezed gently, a quiet reassurance. He had said enough. He had left behind what needed to be left. General Carter scanned the lobby once more. No one looked at Thomas Hale the way they had before. Not out of fear, but because they had just been reminded that some values should never be tested before a crowd. And as the final words faded, consequences began to take shape in silence. Not loud, not dramatic, but deep enough to follow everyone who left that hotel lobby and stay with them for the rest of their lives. The consequences arrived quietly, but unmistakably. Captain Cole was relieved of command. There was no press conference, no public justification. He was reassigned to a different duty, one with less prestige and far greater weight building, and personally teaching a training program on the history of Special Units forces that once existed in silence and were protected by deliberate forgetting. The new assignment forced Cole to read every page of old files to learn names that never appeared in textbooks, to understand why some medals were never awarded before an audience. In the classroom, he no longer spoke with easy confidence. He spoke slowly, precisely, and with the restraint of someone who had learned how much words truly weigh. The Marine Corps issued a brief statement. It named no individuals. It did not recount the incident. Its message focused on one acknowledgement that some veterans had been overlooked, judged by appearance rather than by the memories and sacrifices they carried. The statement did not ask for forgiveness. It affirmed a commitment that respect is not a privilege but a duty. For many, it was just a line of text. For those who had long stood quietly on the margins, it was a late but necessary recognition. Weeks passed. Life returned to its familiar rhythm. Thomas Hale continued his quiet days. He did not seek attention. He never had. One morning in his usual small diner, the smell of old coffee and the clink of spoons against cups unchanged, a young man walked in. He paused for a moment as if weighing something. It was Captain Cole. No uniform, no rank. Just a young man carrying the heaviness of words long unsaid. Cole approached and stopped at the table. "Sir," he said, his voice low and unpracticed, I came to apologize." The words were not polished, but they were real. Cole did not explain. He did not justify himself. He simply stood there and waited, waiting for a response he wasn't sure he deserved. Thomas Hale looked at him. His gaze was neither probing nor judgmental. He looked at Cole as one looks at someone standing at a crossroads. He pulled out the chair across from him and set it down gently. "Sit," Thomas said. "Tell me about yourself." That was all. No lecture. No reproach. An invitation enough to open another path. Cole sat down. For the first time, he did not need to keep his shoulders squared. He did not need to control his voice. He spoke of why he had joined, of his fear of not being good enough, of how he had learned to use rank to hide immaturity. Thomas listened. He did not interrupt. He did not correct. He simply listened, just as he had done his whole life with those younger than himself. On the coat hook beside the table, Thomas's old jacket hung quietly. The Iron Viper patch showed at one small corner. It was no longer a symbol of war, not a sign of glory. It was a reminder that the strongest things do not need to be spoken aloud, and that honor sometimes survives through silence. Cole left the diner as the light outside had grown brighter. He bowed his head to Thomas, not in ceremony, but in the way of a man who knows he has just been given a chance. Thomas watched him go, then turned back to his cooling coffee. He did not smile. He was not sad. He simply remained whole in the calm that had followed him all his life. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please, share this video and subscribe to Service Honor Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten. Service Honor Stories. We remember the quiet heroes,